I'm going to bring the Butte-Silver Bow Council of Commissioners Committee of the Whole meeting to order for Wednesday, February 12th, 2020. Can we please have a roll call?
We have 11 present, 1 presiding, and 0 absent.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner McDonough, would you please lead us in the prayer and the pledge?
Almighty God, we implore you, look upon us and guide us this night as we make decisions which shall greatly affect our community of Butte-Silver Bow. Direct our thoughts, words, and deeds so that we please you and best serve our fellow citizens. Amen.
Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, the first item on tonight's agenda is any public comment on any items that are on tonight's agenda. If you would please state your name and address for the record after turning on the microphone. Thank you very much, Mr. Ray.
John W. Ray, John-Ray, 915 West Galena. And I just wanted to comment a little bit on the item that's coming up on the pole plant. And tomorrow is going to be an exciting day with the announcement of the consent decree. But I think it's important for all of us in Butte not to lose focus on another important Superfund site in the community, the Montana Pole Plant, because it's going to be in some respects competing with the consent decree, but it's very, very important given the nature of the toxics there. And I've been reading the explanation of significant differences report. I think you'll be getting copies of that tonight. And I want to reread it because it deserves a second reading. But I would sort of suggest that perhaps in your consideration of the pole plant this evening, and then as time goes on, the public comment period lasts until March the 10th, that just some issues to kind of keep in front of you and make sure that they're properly addressed. One is the issue of meeting water quality standards. That has been a problem at the pole plant. My understanding is that they're close to meeting water quality standards. But what I'll be interested in hearing as the discussion goes forth is what is the realistic expectation as to when those water quality standards will be met. And my particular concern is the dioxin at the Montana pole plant, which of course was the ingredient in Agent Orange, is very toxic and very dangerous. So I would think that would be one thing to keep before the council. Second, the call is to cap the dioxin on site. And for a while, initially the decision called for active treatment, but that was abandoned in a sense, or no longer the case, made no longer the case a couple of years ago. And so the decision was made to cap the dioxin waste. Caps present unique challenges as to durability, longevity, and protectiveness, and so I'll be interested, and hopefully the community will be interested, in how the state can assure us that these caps will be protective, will be maintained, and that leads to a third issue that will need to be considered, and I know the council has brought it up, future and land use. I know I read that some consideration now, for example, of relocating the animal shelter to the pole plant grounds. I think it will need to be made clear as we go forward what actually can this site be used to do once the cleanup is completed. Well, I know it won't be residential, but what areas will be for industrial, what areas will be for recreation, and what restrictions. For example, if you do locate the Chelsea Bailey Animal Shelter there, that presents unique challenges with the animals, the people working there, as well as people visiting, taking dogs for a walk, and so forth. The final issue that I think we need to also pay attention to is what will happen to the contaminated waste that's under the interstate, because there is a significant amount of waste that has been largely inaccessible because of the overpass and the interstate there, and yet it still presents a danger to Silverbow Creek, how that will be addressed. So those four issues, water quality, the safety of the caps, what will be done about the interstate, and what will be the end land use, I hope are things that we can keep our eye focused and see what kinds of answers come forth. Final thing I would like to do is to thank the Council of Commissioners and the Chief Executive for the interest that you've displayed in Superfund. It's a difficult issue, it's time-consuming, but I think the Council and the Chief Executive has certainly done its due diligence and showed well above the call of duty interest in this issue for the safety of Butte. And I, for one, as a citizen, would like to thank all of you for the time, effort, and skill that you have put into this. And I think it has made and will continue to make a difference as we go forward with the cleanup. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ray. Is there any other public comment on any items on tonight's agenda? Okay. Seeing none, I will move on to the report of the chair. As it was discussed earlier this evening, there will be a press release tomorrow at 11 o'clock at the Finland Hotel regarding the release of the consent decree. So keep in mind this is the first press release that you will be seeing, but there will be many more to follow in regards to public meetings and hearings going forward. So moving on to Section 1, the bid openings, public hearings, and or presentations. Presentation, Communication 2020-54. Lori Casey, Planning Director, requesting Council of Commissioners for time on the February 12th, 2020 Council of Commissioners agenda for a presentation to be given by Kelly Lynch, Deputy Director and General Counsel for the Montana League of Cities and Towns regarding municipal zoning. Ms. Casey, do you have anything to report on?
Mr. Chairman, members of the council, as you may or may not know, over the last several months, there's been a lot of discussion on the zoning ordinance. In particular, as we go through the update of the growth policy, we have been looking very closely at our zoning ordinance, and it's brought a lot of insight to what we do now and how old it is. It was first brought forth in 1978. And there has not been a lot of changes over that time. We've also been talking with real estate agents and others about variances and when it is appropriate to seek a variance from the zoning ordinance. In addition, as you heard testimony about zoning regarding the community residential facilities. So we thought it was an opportune time to have Kelly Lynch come and go give us a presentation on zoning and zoning in general and what it is. Kelly's an expert in land use law, so we thought she was gracious, and she graciously agreed to give us a presentation. So I will turn it over to Kelly Lynch.
Thank you, Ms. Casey. Ms. Lynch, nice to see you.
Hi, Mr. Chairman. How are you doing? So I always bring gifts, so no one, as long as you don't throw it at me. The League, MACO, and the Montana Department of Commerce have, for the last several sessions, biennial sessions, put together this statute book that's basically just the land use and planning statutes. So you can have that with you if you need it without carrying around all the Title 76. So, perfect, thank you. So yeah, Kelly Lynch, I'm Deputy Director and Legal Counsel with the Montana League of Cities and Towns. Before I was at the League of Cities and Towns, I was at the Montana Department of Commerce running the Community Technical Assistance Program, which is land use and technical assistance for local governments. And before that, as a land use attorney. So even though now I'm doing pretty much all municipal stuff, my background's in land use law, so I always jump at an opportunity to do a presentation on land use. So tonight, just focusing mostly on zoning. I know you guys use municipal zoning, so I will try and go over that. This sounds like a really opportune time to talk about some of the issues with the zoning ordinance. Since you're going through the growth policy update, you're going to be coming up with some of the goals and objectives, long-term goals and objectives you want to see for your community, and the zoning ordinance is really pretty much the most common place to start implementing those. So, but please jump in if you have any questions or something doesn't make sense or you have something that I don't touch on that you want to chat about. It's always obviously easier if you ask questions. And also my family's from Butte, so maybe that'll give you some reason to listen to me. It's not Lynch, but I'm not going to tell you who it is because otherwise half of you won't listen to me anymore. Hopefully I get this down right. This is not my forte. Oh, that was a lot of pointing. All right. So just a quick overview. Touch on police power, some of your powers as a self-governing power, the growth policy real quickly and how that relates to zoning, and then I'm going to talk about some of the specifics of zoning, including different types you can look at, the variance issue I know has been raised, conditional use permits, what's non-conforming, the ability of you to do interim zoning or urgency zoning, and then I'm just going to list some of the other things you can kind of think about as you go through this process. So the police power, essentially back in the 1920s, the U.S. Supreme Court held that the power to adopt and enforce zoning regulations that protect public health and safety is essentially within your police power. So you have the authority to zone as a local government, and so long as you tie those things to pretty broad areas of public health, safety, and welfare, you really have a lot of flexibility and broad authority to regulate land uses in your community. The extent of that police power in Montana depends on the type of government. As a self-governing power, you have the most extensive power that's available to municipalities in Montana. You essentially are able to provide any service, perform any function, or exercise any power that's not specifically prohibited by the legislature through the state statutes, the Constitution, law, or charter, but it's typically in the statutes. It gets a little weird when you're talking about something like land use and zoning because they have very specific statutes that relate to what you are supposed to do with respect to zoning, and so the statute does address that, but specifically say that you have to follow those requirements, but where discretion is allowed, you can substantially comply with the statute. You're also allowed to adopt things that are more restrictive than the statute. You just always have to tie that back to public health and safety and what's called the low criteria, and I'll go over those. There are some places in which, and I heard you talking about one of them tonight, there are some places in which the Montana legislature has said, we don't want you to act in a different way. So they've preempted you or prohibited you from acting in a particular way. So some examples of that are the treating community residential facilities serving 8 or fewer persons as a residential use. I know there's a discussion about doing that as a conditional use permit, which is actually said in the statute that you can do that, but there is an attorney general opinion on that where they denied it, where the attorney general said you can't deny it. So you can go ahead and require a conditional use permit, see if there are things you can do, and we'll talk about conditional use permits to try and mitigate the land use impacts on neighboring uses, but you won't be able to deny that use. So that's an example of where the legislature said we want to constrain your powers as a local government. Another place is there's a statute that requires that everyone treat manufactured housing as the same in property values in residentially zoned districts. So prior to that statute being adopted, a lot of communities would use the evidence that it would affect property values as the reason for denying manufactured housing in otherwise just residential zones, and the state legislature stepped in and said you can't do that. And then another place I wanted to mention is on the federal level, where you can also be preempted by federal law. It's pretty rare for them to get involved in land use regulation, but they have gotten fairly involved in that in their area of telecommunications, and they continue to do that even recently. But federal statute for the Telecommunications Act says that you can't regulate the placement of wireless facilities based on environmental effects of transmission. So you can look at things like the historic nature of a tower, maybe the aesthetics, but you can't say we don't want to allow it near residential facilities because people might get hurt by electronic transmissions. There are plenty others. These are just examples. You could adopt, I mentioned this, additional types of land uses as long as it's not prohibited, but you need that to fall within your power, your police power, and also comply with the low criteria, which I will talk about. So you're starting this process of going through your growth policy. That really is kind of the first thing that you do. Your growth policy was, I believe, in 2008. So it is ready for an update. And this is the place where you're going to be talking about all the kinds of goals and objectives you want to see for your community in terms of its development. Over the next, typically you look at it out about 20 years. The Montana Supreme Court has identified the growth policy as the preeminent planning tool. It acknowledges this as the place where it's going to look when you are trying to defend one of your land use decisions. When it looks at your growth policy, it's going to make sure that you're in compliance with this kind of overall comprehensive plan that you've adopted. Why do a growth policy? The most important thing, obviously, for our purposes here tonight is that you have to have a growth policy before you adopt zoning. And it has to be in compliance with the statute, the growth policy statutes. So you're in the process of doing that. It also helps create consensus in the community about what regulations you're going to adopt and why you're adopting them, because it's a pretty comprehensive public process to go through the update of a growth policy. It helps with your review and decision-making on subdivisions. I've listed some of the other things you might see as how you implement your goals and objectives in your growth policy, doing downtown plans, urban renewal. All of those things are going to be touched on in the growth policy. And then finally, it's used for planning for capital improvements. Gives you a sense of what you're going to see 20 years from now and what you're going to need to do in terms of public services and public facilities to accommodate that growth. The growth policy itself is not a regulatory document, so you have to come up with implementing regulations in order to accomplish what you identify as what you want to see in the growth policy. You can't make any decisions essentially based on whether or not something's in compliance with the growth policy. It has to be related to some other type of implementing regulation. Typically, that's going to be your zoning ordinance, but probably the other most common one you'll see is their subdivision regulations. But your local land use regulations have to substantially comply with all pertinent elements of the growth policy. So if you're talking about a housing CUP, you're going to need to make that decision in substantial compliance with the growth policy. If you're talking about updating your entire zoning ordinance, which it sounds like you're going to do after the growth policy, the court, if the challenge, the court is going to look to make sure that that entire document is in conformance with the growth policy. So that growth policy language is really important for showing the court, showing your citizens what you intend to do with regulation. Okay, any questions so far? We'll get to the meat of it here. I'm really proud of myself that I found pictures of Butte, and I remembered to get pictures of Butte. Sometimes I forget. That is Butte. I know, you can tell. Okay, yeah, I didn't do that. They don't usually let the attorneys touch any technological items. Okay, so what is zoning? It essentially directs the form and use of land and buildings. Pretty much that simple. You guys, as mentioned by Ms. Casey, have a pretty old zoning ordinance. It's not by any means the oldest zoning ordinance in Montana. It might be the oldest of the big seven, but it's pretty typical for that time. And honestly, we haven't moved a whole ways away from the type of zoning ordinance that you have. It's the most common method for implementing the goals and objectives of the growth policy. You might do other things as well, and I can talk about those, but the growth policy is really going to be, the zoning ordinance is really going to be what you use to implement your goals and objectives. It applies to all tracts of records, so when you're looking at subdivision regulations, for instance, they only apply to when you're creating new tracts of record. Zoning applies to all tracts of record, even if they're existing. I'll talk about non-conforming uses and lots that are already in existence, and you change the regulations on them. It's flexible. You can essentially do whatever you want with the zoning ordinance to reflect what you want to happen in your community. And we've talked about how U.S. Supreme Court as well as Montana Supreme Court have identified zoning as lawful use of your police power. So what does the state statute say you have to do? The growth policy has to be updated in compliance with statutory requirements for you to amend your zoning ordinance, and you're in the process of doing that now. When you adopt that zoning, the state statute says you have to have a public hearing with at least 15 days notice. I'm guessing that's probably the very least that you're going to see, but the state does identify that process for you. Your amendments to the zoning ordinance are subject to protest. There's a possible supermajority vote requirement based on that protest, and then there's a 3-part little test, which I won't go into, but anytime there's an amendment, I'm sure the county attorney can give you some help on that. And then finally, the Zoning Commission is appointed to recommend zoning boundaries and regulations to the council, and I think you guys have a zoning commission, right? So that's all in state statute. The state statute then says, okay, there's some other things that you could think about and do, and we're giving you that authority. You, as a self-governing power, wouldn't need that specific authority, but the general governing powers would. But it's a nice list of things you might also be able to do. You can appoint a board of adjustment to hear administrative appeals and variances. For municipal zoning, you don't have to have that board of adjustment be the final decision maker. You can keep the final decision-making authority with you and have them be an advisory board, so then if they made a denial, it can come back to you before it goes to district court. That's something that municipalities have. You have interim zoning. That's actually identified as a specific statutory provision in the law as an urgency measure. So if you are contemplating land changes, you're contemplating doing maybe some restrictions on a certain type of land use, you are allowed to do an emergency zoning ordinance and not follow the typical process. You have to give 7 days notice, have a public hearing. You don't have to do a second reading, and that goes into effect for 6 months, and you can extend it up to a year. It allows you to do extraterritorial zoning. I don't think that's as much of a concern for Butte-Silver, since you have municipal zoning authority over the county. And then we talked about you can adopt higher standards than required unless the state statute does specifically prohibit you from doing that. Other than that, it's all pretty much left to you. You get to go through this really exciting, well, of course, I think it's exciting process of all of the things that you do to regulate land use in your community and have you figure out what you want to see in your community. And you would have done a lot of this on a kind of a broad-based level with the growth policy, but now you get down to the nitty-gritty for each lot. How is it going to be regulated? What's going to be allowed to do? It includes looking at all the allowable uses and the forms in each district. When I say form, I mean the physical form, which typically are looked at as development standards. That's how you have them listed in your zoning ordinance right now. You get to do definitions. The state doesn't define many of the things in zoning, so you get to go through that fun process. Development standards that you can look to regulate property include a minimum and maximum lot size. You can do lot coverage or floor area ratio, so how big is all of the floor area compared to the entire lot, or you can do how much of your lot can be covered by basically impervious surfaces, so garages, porches, all of that. I know this sounds crazy, and I'm sure the audience is like, this person loves regulation. But this is kind of my life, so I'm just kind of explaining to you what all these terms mean. You could talk about building and structure height. You can look at setbacks. They can be different for different areas of the lot. You can look at parking requirements, landscaping, sign regulations. The list is really kind of goes on ad infinitum. So I talked about the low criteria. When you adopt and amend zoning regulations, you always have to meet the low criteria. These are set forth in statute, but they're called the low criteria because they were really put into place as a criteria for your review by a case from the Montana Supreme Court called the Low case. I'm not going to read through them. You can see what they are, but just keep in mind that whenever you are looking at a zoning ordinance or a zoning ordinance amendment, these are the things that the court's going to want you to look at and expect you to go through this. Consider everything, look at the evidence that you have based on all of these, and make a decision based on that evidence. I getting better? So those are the cases for you, and the citation for the statute where it's set out. So what types of zoning? Right now you have what's called Euclidean zoning, and I mentioned that Euclid versus Ambler, a realty case from the U.S. Supreme Court. That's why it's called Euclidean zoning. That's kind of the traditional type. After that case came out, I believe it was from New York, the U.S. Department of Commerce put together state enabling acts for various types of land use regulation, and they did a state zoning enabling act. Our state statute looks very much like that, so you'll see a lot of that coming from the 1920s. It's why the statute reads pretty antiquated, but that's why it's called Euclidean zoning, and it's the traditional type of zoning that you know about. You have residential zone, commercial zones, industrial zones, and never the thrice shall meet. The uses are all separated. You have uses by right, so permitted use. You have a conditional use where they have to go through a review process, and you can add conditions to mitigate impacts to surrounding land uses. And then you have the ability to prohibit certain uses. The development standards are kind of an afterthought, and those are applied to control merely the physical form and design of the actual development of the lot. But there are some other types of zoning in use now, probably over, I would say, the last 20 to 30 years. Performance zoning, an example of this in Montana is Lake County, just south of Polson. They regulate the intensity of use, so all they regulate is density. There's no specific types of uses associated with that. There's only a density requirement across the county, and there's a map associated with that. That's a type of performance zoning. Other ones are typically focused on environmental resources, so you are doing something that mitigates or requires a type of use or intensity of use based on protection of an open space or wetland or agricultural values. I don't see that as being something that probably would work really well in a really urbanized area. It's tended to be used more in rural areas. Form-based zoning is something we've seen a lot of movement on. Essentially, it moves away entirely from the idea of regulating use, and it's focused almost exclusively on regulating the form. So if you meet this type of form, if you're set back this far, if you have this amount of parking, if you have this kind of landscaping, this amount of height, it doesn't matter what you're using that structure for. It's a huge change to go from Euclidean zoning to form-based zoning, but some communities have done it. Billings started out with the idea that they would do a form-based zone when they did their zoning code update, but they ended up with hybrid zoning, which I'll talk about next. The one thing I love about form-based zoning is there's lots of graphics and visuals to guide development. So if you have a great relationship with your realtors, with your building community, using graphics and visual to show them what you'd like to see is really helpful for them. They can come in the door showing you basically what you've already decided you'd like to see because they've seen pictures of it. So that's one thing you might want to think about when you use your zoning ordinance. You can pull some of that kind of idea from form-based zoning without doing form-based zoning. And then finally, hybrid zoning is really just a variation on some or all of the above. That is what Billings ended up with, so if you are interested in that, you can take a look at their code. They do things like, and they only do it specifically in some of the more urbanized areas, very specific urbanized areas in their community. But some of the things they do is, okay, we're going to permit the use of residential by right, but only upstairs. So they don't have to deal with kind of these other issues of single-family zoning. It's really creating a mixed-use zone in a commercial area and not having to go through the review process for the residential part of it. So kind of think innovatively. Variances are kind of the first thing that come up. Once you've gone through the process, you set up your zoning ordinance. It's pretty comprehensive. You've talked about all the exciting things like definitions. Then you have a process by which someone comes in and says, I've got a weird property. It has it looks normal if you're looking at it on paper, but the whole front 50 feet of the property, goes like this. So you want me to set back at this top part by 100 feet. If I do that, I have to build almost entirely on this slope that's not buildable, or it's going to cost a whole lot more to do it, or I can't get a house on there. That's the kind of thing that you're going to see a variance for, and you probably have seen. I don't know if the variances are coming all the way to the commission or if they're just being decided by your Board of Adjustment. Okay, so your Board of Adjustment's the final decision maker for variances. So, well, put your head how they would have to look at it. Usually variances, and the whole idea behind variances, that you are allowing deviations from the physical development standards. So you're not allowing deviations from the use necessarily, but from those physical development standards, whether it's setbacks or height, parking requirements, landscaping requirements, something along that nature. And that's kind of the Euclidean zoning way that you use variances. And a lot of that is because of this crazy separation of uses, right? So you shouldn't have residential and commercial. So if you're looking for a variance from the commercial restriction, then that's why the whole idea of a variance for use doesn't work really well with Euclidean zoning. I think it's more just of how that ended up. Okay, now I'm getting mad at myself. So the state statute, again, puts forth the actual grounds for variances, and it uses a conjunctive list, so it's an and. All three of these have to be met in order to issue a variance. That came from the 1926 State Standard Act that I mentioned. So it really hasn't been changed. Montana adopted it, and that's what we still have. There have been a couple of words added to this list, not in the statute itself, but from the cases reviewing the statute. So it can't be contrary to the public interest. That's always a finding you have to make, and you have to have evidence to support it. A literal enforcement of the ordinance has to result in unnecessary hardship, and it's owing to, in the statute says special conditions, but the courts have added unique to the property. And then the spirit of the ordinance has to be observed and substantial justice done. So you always have to meet those three when you're granting a variance. You have to have the findings, and you have to have evidence to support those findings. Just walk through a little bit of it. Unnecessary hardship is usually where people struggle the most in terms of making those findings. The courts have said that financial or economic difficulties is not enough to grant to find an unnecessary hardship. It's related more to what I was talking about with the physical characteristics of the property. So there's something about the property that is going to prohibit this owner from using the property in essentially the same way that the neighbors get to use the same types of properties. So everyone gets residential, and for some reason this guy can't get residential. Everyone gets a single-family home or a duplex, and for some reason this guy can't get a duplex. So that kind of makes sense how the analysis works. And I will mention it's not just for a property. You could also have a variance for a structure, a sign. They want to be able to place a sign or have a sign at a height that other folks have gotten to have, and for some reason they need a variance because they can't do it at that height. Maybe there's a huge tree or a rock in front of it, and so they've got to have a different height. That's the kind of physical characteristics of the property that you'd be looking at. So I listed some of those other things. They might not get a garage. Everybody else gets a garage. The generous granting of variances is a really good sign that you need to update your zoning ordinance because it's not reflecting what your community is doing anymore. So I'm just have you look at some better approaches. First option would be to reevaluate the regulation itself. Has the neighborhood changed in some way that's not reflected anymore in the actual regulation? Did you have a reason for the regulation in the first place and that reason's not there anymore? So kind of looking at what you were trying to accomplish. I think this is going to be pretty easy when you've just gone through the growth policy process. Now you're going to know exactly what it is you're going to want to see in terms of regulation. You can reevaluate the process. Have you added, it doesn't sound like you have added additional guidance. Sometimes folks do. But maybe the decision makers need help understanding or applying the criteria. They're not understanding what unnecessary hardship means. They're not understanding what unique to the property means. So maybe just some guidance in the ordinance itself that helps them understand what each one of those criteria are. And the last thing you can do is amend the standard. Everybody's getting a variance. Why do we even have this regulation in the first place? And you could provide some flexibility in the standard. So, okay, if it's this type of property, you can have this, have some variation in what the standard would be. So conditional use permits, these are typically uses that aren't permitted by right, but they're still appropriate. In that zoning district, you just want to add some conditions to make sure that that's the case. So a good example would be a more intensive type of commercial use in a neighborhood commercial zone. So parking, noise, hours of operation. It's kind of the same stuff. The easiest example is adult activity. What's the word? Adult business. You know what I'm talking about. So allowing those, you're going to see a lot of land use impacts resulting from that. And so you're really focused on what types of conditions can you place on that, and then you enforce those conditions afterwards. You make sure that they're meeting those. If they're not, you're getting complaints from the neighbors. You can revoke that permit. That's opposed to a permit use by right, like residential. It also gives the public a process for going through and hearing what the evidence is. They get to comment on it. They get to hear why it's going to be permitted or not. Non-conforming uses, you probably hear this term a lot. It's uses, structures, or lots that were existing at the time that you either adopt a zoning ordinance and put regulations on them, or you change the regulations on them. So they were legal at the time, and now they've essentially become out of conformance with your regulations. So we don't refer to them as illegal, refer to them as legally non-conforming because they really didn't do anything to become illegal. And typically they're allowed to continue by right but for some period of time. In Montana, it's usually unlimited period of time, but other places do what's called amortization, where you require them to stop the use, or more typically a structure like a sign, after a certain period of time. And you do an analysis about when they will get their money back, essentially, for what was invested in that sign. You put limitations on expanding them, on abandoning them, and if they're destroyed, they get like a certain amount of destruction and they get to rebuild. If not, then they're done. So that's something you're going to want to think about. You do have a bit of non-conforming discussion in your zoning ordinance now. You also want to make sure that when you're looking at changing a non-conforming use or making non-conforming uses, that you're going to allow those folks to have some use of the property. So let's say you put a minimum lot size for single-family zoning, and you have a lot that's too small. It doesn't meet that lot size. That's okay, but they haven't built on it yet. So when they come in to build on it, you can't enforce that minimum lot size against them. It's probably going to be an issue of takings. So just be aware that there are some issues like that with non-conforming uses. Same thing with the amortization clause. If you make someone remove something that was legally non-conforming, you want to think about how long it would take for them to get their money back for their investment in that. I mentioned interim zoning really quick. It's essentially urgency zoning. The state statute puts forth what you can do. It's pretty flexible. It doesn't really say anything about what the terms have to be or why you're doing it. You make the decision as what constitutes an urgent situation. All you need to show is that you're contemplating some kind of zoning proposal or you're studying it. All right, I'm almost done. I could see some folks nodding off. I don't know why you're not totally excited by all of this, but getting creative. I just wanted to list some of the things that you might see communities do once they really get into the zoning discussion and start to utilize regulations to the benefit of the community. Density bonuses are something that you can offer. Once you have pretty good zoning ordinance regulations in place, you can offer density bonuses above and beyond what's allowed in a certain area as basically a carrot for them to do some of the things that you'd like to see them do in terms of the development. Inclusionary housing requires a certain amount of affordable housing units with any type of residential development. Bozeman has a version of that. Historic resource protection, I don't know if you guys already have this, but that's something that you can overlay, so it doesn't necessarily apply to a particular zone. You can overlay it over a bunch of zones where you have historical properties, historical resources, and that's an additional layer of development standards or review that those folks have to go through to protect that historic resource. You can do design guidelines or regulations to basically drive the look of your community or entrances to your community in a particular way. Hopefully the opposite of the road into Helena. You could do transit-oriented development where you really focus some seriously dense, high urbanized development around transit stations. So you've got a bus station or you've got a place where two bus lines cross. That would be a place where you want to increase density so that people don't have to have parking. They're not going to use cars, they're going to use buses. And then have the less dense development further away from those areas. Cluster development is essentially used to protect resources. So you've got big lots, you have those single family units all look at one area of the property instead of going over with 20 acres apiece, something you might see out on the flatlands. Is that what you call it? Flatlands? What do you call it? I know this is uptown. I got that part. I've been trained on that. Mixed-use zones, when you have Euclidean zoning, mixing uses is not something that you do, but you might be able to start thinking about doing that, allowing residential and commercial in the same area so you can kind of see that older nature of like the local grocery store, the housing above the bookstore, that kind of use. Some communities prohibit ground floor office space to really encourage that feel, that urbanized, walkable feel of being able to shop and not having kind of a closed up look on that bottom floor. Encouraging adaptive reuse. I saw that you guys did have, I'm not sure, maybe a couple years ago, discussion about infill development. So figuring out ways to encourage developers to use that old types of property. Again, that's something you can use like density bonuses in coordination with. Think about tiny homes. This is always a great topic. Everyone loves tiny homes. Are you going to allow them? How are you going to allow them? Where are you going to allow them? Sign regulations, you can have pretty much nothing, or you could have, the most constrictive sign regulations in Montana. Bozeman has some pretty regulatory ones. If you drive in 7th Avenue, you'll see almost every sign is not above 6 feet above the ground. It's all, very small. They're not electronic. That all happens through regulation. And then, hillside regulations, if you have some areas where the slopes are very steep, you might want to talk about having some specific regulations for development. Just throwing out some of the ideas that you can think about, because I know you want to spend months and months and months really going through this zoning ordinance and making it the best it can be. So that's really all I had. Just kind of wanted to give you the 101 of zoning, what you can do, what you can't do, and have fun with it. Any questions?
Thank you, Kelly. Does any commissioners have any questions?
Excellent. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Next item on tonight's agenda is Communication 2020-56. Jenny Chambers, Waste Management and Remediation Division Administrator, requesting Council of Commissioners for time on the February 12th, 2020 Council of Commissioners agenda for a presentation to be given by the Montana Department of Environmental Quality, DEQ. Mr. Sesso, I don't know who you want me to call on this. Is Jenny here? Oh, you got to turn the microphone on, John. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, John Sesso, Superfund Coordinator. I'll just introduce David Bowers and Allie Archer. Yeah, it's what it says on there, but instead of Jenny, we got David Bowers from the Department of Environmental Quality. He's going to go over the Montana Poll stuff, and his associate will also chime in, maybe not. So,
Okay.
thanks.
Mr. Bowers, the floor is yours. Thank you. Thank you for coming tonight, and welcome.
Thank you
Mr.
very
Bowers.
much. Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, my name is David Bowers, for the record, Bowers, and I'm here on behalf of the Department of Environmental Quality to speak to you about the Montana Poll site and the release of the explanation of significant difference for the rod at the Montana Poll site. I gave 3 hard copies of the ESD, draft ESD, to you. I also want to let you know, as you may be aware from your stakeholder letter that you received from us, that there is a link where you can get this document electronically as well, and also that there's a link to our Montana Poll webpage, which also has the summary, which I'm hoping some of you were sent the link to that. It looks something like this, with the back that looks like this. I think this is a very good starting point for you to get information and a feel for what the explanation of significant difference is doing. My purpose tonight is to inform you of the public comment schedule and a little bit about the purpose of the ESD, to give you a feel for what the Department of Environmental Quality and the EPA are doing as far as the rollout to engage the Butte citizenry as effectively as we possibly can, and then give you an idea of what the next steps would be once the public comment period closes. So first of all, just a quick overview of the public comment period. It started on February 10th, on Monday, and it will run for 30 days and end on March 10th. In between there, on February 18th, next Tuesday, there will be an ESD open house at the conference center at the Butte Brewery. And that basically is the heart of the schedule. We're also working with the neighborhoods adjoining the Montana Poll site on getting a community meeting there so the folks can have a firsthand interaction and find out what is planned through the ESD. The rollout for the ESD, we took in 2017, we completed interaction document, a community interaction document that tried to address a lot of the suggestions that the community gave to us about how to engage the citizenry. We have public notification that started 1 week prior to the rollout. It was advertised in the paper. We sent out letters to stakeholders, which included yourselves, the BSB Superfund, the BSB County Health, the CTEC tag group here in town, and also sent those notices to the Boulevard and Williamsburg neighborhoods 1 week prior to the public comment period. We also did a social media rollout on Monday through Facebook and Twitter for those people that might be more comfortable with that type of advertisement, advertising the public comment period. And we also just completed a press release announcing the ESD. We also sent a link to the fact sheet that I just held up a few minutes ago to all the stakeholders, and we also sent that via snail mail to our neighbors at the Neighborhood Boulevard and Williamsburg communities. And finally, the ESD and the ESD administrative record are available at the Superfund repository at Montana Tech Library. And it's also, both of those are electronically available through the DEQ website. Again, the web page for Montana Poll. And we also have a public comment page for DEQ that has a direct link as well. And EPA will have a link up as well as soon as my associated EPA, Allie Archer, returns. And finally, our DEQ web page, again, like I said, has the ESD, has the administrative record, and it also has the summary and a number of other documents that have recently been put out over the past 5 or 6 years. So that's what we're doing to reach out to the Butte citizenry. We're also, I'm here tonight to talk to you about the next steps. So what happens after public comment? As Dr. John Ray has pointed out, there are definitely things that the public should be aware of. There are legitimate concerns, and I'm hoping that the public is engaged in the discussion. One of the things that I think is important to note is that an ESD does not require a public comment period. But because of the active engagement of the TAG group at CTEC, we are offering the public comment period because we think it's valuable and it's going to be an effective way to make sure that everybody understands what the cleanup we're trying to bring to you is and what potential comments that we can take and make that even better if possible. So we'll have a responsiveness summary after the public comment period where we'll take in the comments, we'll address the needed changes as we see fit, and then we will finalize the ESD and the cleanup plan. And that will include EPA concurrence with a signature from Region 8. Also, during that time, we will begin remedial design and hopefully get the bid process. We can't start the bid process until we have concurrence and that the ESD has a signature, but we will definitely be gearing up for that. We will also keep close contact with the Butte-Silver on future land use and how that design is coming along. And then we're hoping our biggest goal here is to have construction in the summer of 2020. For that to happen, all of the other things need to take place first, obviously, but we are gearing up for construction in 2020. There are a number of things that need to fall in place, like I said, and if not, it will definitely take place in 2021. Construction completion report will follow the construction, and this is the official document that DEQ uses to demonstrate that what happened in construction and whether or not we met our cleanup goals or not. And then finally, to continue to coordinate with Butte-Silver on the future land use at the site. And then finally, the last thing I'd like to do is our public meeting is, again, Tuesday, February 18th, and I would like to extend a personal invitation to all of you to attend next Tuesday night, to come on out. It's an open house format with a brief presentation in the beginning, and we have 6 stations that are going to be set up to explain the various aspects of the cleanup and what's going on with the site. So I look forward to seeing you. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'd be more than welcome to answer them.
David, just one question. Next Tuesday, February 18th, what time and the place again?
It's at the Butte Brewery at 6:30 is when it'll start.
Okay. 6:30. Okay, any questions? Commissioner Sorich.
Thank you, Mr. Bowers. I apologize for interrupting you.
Oh, no problem.
Anyways, I got a question. What can you tell us about the funding source and refresh my memory, what's going to fund the cleanup and how much is going to be left and what's
Good question. First of all, the funding source, Montana Pole is a settlement site, and we currently have in the neighborhood of $28 million. And it is up to the Department of Environmental Quality and EPA to manage and work through that money to clean the site up. And at this point in time, how much this cleanup will cost, it's too early to call because there's so many different parts that go into it. We've got a land treatment unit to remove. We've got a corrective action management unit, a CAMU to construct where we're going to manage the waste on site. We've got stormwater construction, stormwater management construction that needs to take place. There's a lot of moving parts, and so it's too early to tell. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Follow-up, Commissioner Mankins.
Thank you for coming tonight, David. The one thing that I got the letter that you sent out to the neighborhood, and I don't know if I can get a sneak preview of this or if I have to wait till the 18th, but in paragraph 3, the DEQ has written a draft explanation of significant differences which explains the proposed changes to the cleanup plan and explain why those changes are necessary. The proposed change includes establishing more protective cleanup levels and why that we are changing those now from what was done prior to that. If you could explain maybe why or what happened prior.
Sure.
Seeing that I'm a year into this job and kind of looking more into what's going to happen for the future for this pole plant.
Yes. The ROD came out in 1993. And at that time, the ROD stated that we were going to do active bioremediation of the waste there, which included 3 contaminants, the pentachlorophenol, the polyaromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs, as they're known in a group, and then the dioxins that were on site. And that was carried through. It was realized early on that we were not going to obtain the dioxin cleanup number. And so the soils that were offloaded were not going to meet the ROD requirement. And so that is why, one of the reasons why we're changing and doing the ESD. You'll notice that the dioxin dropped from 200 parts per trillion down to 30 parts per trillion. That's a significant drop as far as the cleanup level. We felt that by doing that, it was the desire of working with Butte-Silver to create a land use that would be conducive to industrial, light industrial, and commercial use. And so we felt that that number was a better number to use than the recreational number that was in the record of decision. The second one, the pentachlorophenol, dropped from 34,000 parts per billion down to 2,000 parts per billion. And that one was done because to create a protection to groundwater. In 1993, there was definitely an understanding that contaminants were getting to the groundwater, and that it was really felt that source control was the most effective way to deal with that. So you dig up all the contaminant, you treat it and so forth, whatever it's there, get rid of it. But there wasn't a complete understanding of what we call the fate and transporter, or how contaminants work their way down to the groundwater. And it turns out to be protective of the groundwater so that the contaminant doesn't make it to the groundwater. It was going to require a much more conservative number than the 34,000 that we had in the ROD. And so we took a look, we did a data gap investigation, took a look at what we had out there, and did the modeling and realized that 2,000 was the appropriate number to protect the groundwater. So, long answer, but that's how those came about.
Follow-up, Commissioner Mankins.
So from 93, when we did that cleanup, or attempt to clean up? Who was paying for it then?
It was the settlement fund again. This
Is this
site,
still, sorry to interrupt, is that still out of that 28 million that we're talking
correct.
about today?
That site, since the rod and the negotiation of the settlement, everything from that point forward has come out of that settlement fund.
So we're still flush at 28 million?
Yes.
Okay. Any other follow-up? Commissioner Fisher.
Thank you, Chairman Morgan. Thank you, Mr. Bowers, for being here. I don't know that I have any questions, but I've got some concerns. I was raised on the boulevard, and before the highway came through, Interstate 1590, and there was ponds of what we call creosote. I'm sure it's got a chemical name that's more strong than that now, but when the highway come through and they're building the bridges there was ponds of this where they treated this lumber in there. And when you go along the railroad track back down to the south and east, that is where most of the, probably the soil is contaminated. And I've had many concerns, just like that Dr. Ray said, about capping the dioxins and assuring us what it is. And, you know, now that we talk about putting an animal shelter out there possibly in the future and future use of that program, I can tell you as a kid, I was born in 1955, but in the 65 era and in that era, there was many times when we'd have our dogs down around there and they'd walk through that area and they'd lick their paws and they'd be dead the next day. So I just want to emphasize that this area of the Montana Pole, the pole plant, in that area under the bridge and alongside that railroad track that goes back, it isn't so much to the east where the problem is, where a lot of the work was done. But right under the bridge in the interstate, like Dr. Ray stated, there are some major concerns there, and I know they're pumping groundwater, and I know there's been some, failed attempts to clean up that area. But I, as a citizen that grew up in that area, have many concerns about that because many people in that area have been diagnosed with MS, Parkinson's, cancer, and I feel that this Montana Pole site is probably as an active time bomb as any of the Superfund or the priority soils that we're dealing with, whether it be over by the, the Civic Center in them areas. So I just wanted to emphasize a little bit that a cleanup in that area and future use, I just don't know that capping that and putting anything there without having a good assurance that things are there, because I, for one, can tell you that I've seen dead animals and I've seen people that had diseases from that area long before 1993 in them areas like that. So I appreciate all you do. I just wanted to voice my concerns and thank you for coming.
Comment noted, and I'd like to add that, I think that's one of the reasons why when the first complaint was filed in 1983 that there was an oily, leaky substance coming out of the bank and going into Silverbow Creek, that it was investigated, and within a couple of years, EPA was out doing an emergency removal. I think that's because they recognized that very concern. And there continued to be emergency removals and actions during the whole process of leading up to the record of decision in 1993. The remedial investigation, I think, was thorough and identified those things. One of the biggest concerns we have is what we're going to do with what's under the interstate. It's still there. It needs to be addressed. However, we do have remedial pieces in place. The capture trenches that we have and everything else are that is ensuring at this point in time that the contaminants are not reaching Silverbow Creek. But we feel like there's a better chance on the horizon when we finish up this construction and start looking at the groundwater again and start looking at how we're going to attack what's under the interstate. Because we can get under there with the technologies that we have now with directional drilling and so forth. And we just need to figure out what we're going to do. You bet.
Thank you. Any other questions? Commissioner Anderson.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you very much for being here. I appreciate your time. I have some concerns that kind of echo what Commissioner Fisher said. In my tenure on council, I've had numerous emails on this. I've had numerous questions. We had numerous presentations from different people with the DEQ and EPA. And it seems like, depending on the situation, we get different answers. I hear that dioxins are bad but safe at some levels. I hear they're not good at other levels, and what have you. So if you could offer some clarification, what is a safe level for dioxin, I'd appreciate that. Another presentation we had, you mentioned earlier light industrial use, what we're aiming for now. I remember back a few years ago when we were thinking about using the pole site for the county shops. At one point there, we had a presentation, and the idea was kind of nixed at that time. One of the people doing the presentation said that it would be used for recreational at most. And he said there would not be any development allowed on that. And so I asked, well, we can plant some trees. He said, no, we can't plant trees. I asked, well, we can build some little swing sets and playgrounds for the kids. No swings or playgrounds because of the damage that these items would do to the cap. He said you'd have a grass field, and that would be the extent of it. So how do we go from one presentation where we have somebody saying that due to the contamination, we have to have basically a grass field with no playground equipment, no lighting, no trees, no shade, no restrooms or any of that because of the damage it can do. And then later on we have a presentation from somebody on this also where they're saying that we can have people working here 40 hours a week, 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year, and they'll be fine. How do we reconcile those differences that we're getting from different parts of different agencies talking about the same site?
Again, great question, and two questions. Let me address the dioxins first. Dioxins are complex. They're nasty. There's a list that's this long of what are called dioxins and furans. It just goes on and on. There are some that are worse than others. What I would encourage, well, first of all, the new cleanup number for the dioxins is vetted through very careful analysis that is provided with guidance from the EPA, and our risk assessor arrives at that by using that guidance. And it's based on use, how many hours of exposure, 40 hours a week, like you said, 50 weeks a year. But even better than my explanation tonight, I would encourage you to come out Tuesday night, because one of the stations at the open house that we're going to have addresses dioxins specifically. And we're going to have a risk assessor there that can answer all of your questions and understand about what is safe, understand the origins of dioxins, because they come from a lot of things, and we find them in a lot of things. And so I hope that would be a good motivator to get out there on Tuesday night. As far as the cap, that is, the ESD is one of the main reasons and driving forces. It's a significant difference what we're going to do as far as the capping. What was described in the ROD was to put just to cover with anywhere from 6 to 24 inches of soil over the finished product, and that would be done. The explanation of the significant difference is how we're going to change that capping strategy. We're going to manage all of the contamination that does not meet the new cleanup levels, which includes all of the treated soils, because the dioxins don't meet. And it's going to include all of the additional soils that don't meet the pentachlorophenol, the new cleanup for the PCP. All of those soils are going to be collected, put into one spot, and managed with an engineered cap that has design requirements that we have to follow. Not that we wouldn't follow them anyway, but it's very specific to managing this waste. This waste cannot leave the site. It is a listed hazardous waste, and so we've got to come up with an effective way to manage that and be protective. And so working closely with Butte-Silver to try to accommodate their vision of the property as well, we came up with this management scheme where 9 of the 36 acres will be used for the CAMU, the Corrective Action Management Unit, to manage those soils with an earthen cover that also has a plastic, what's called an HDPE liner that goes over the top of it. That prevents the rain from penetrating. And then we will have that being managed and looked after on a regular basis, because just on the other side of the freeway, we've got our water treatment plant operator, and so every day he's got to drive by there to go to work, and he's going to see that. One of the things I would encourage you to do is to look closely at the picture that was given to you in this information. The green mound that you see there is at the Stimson Lumber Company in Bonner. That green mound is their CAMU that houses a very similar dioxin product called PCBs that they had to clean up. And this property has now been developed all the way around it, including the Kettle House Brewery and the Kettle House Amphitheater. So that property had a very similar fate at one time, but now it's being used. And I look at Montana Pole and I see a why not? Why can't we? So, again, I encourage you to come out on Tuesday and hear the rest of the story and find out what our people are doing. I believe I've got some great people working for me with some very creative ideas. And that's about it.
Okay. Follow-up, Commissioner Anderson.
Thank you. Just one quick follow-up. When we do put this cap on there, I was looking at some diagrams a while back. I was trying to pull them up here, and I can't find them, but I'll find them later on and hopefully have them for the meeting on Tuesday. I know there is I know there's water running through this area and some power that will be having to be brought into any facilities or industrial complex that may or may not be built out there. How is that going to impact when we're moving earth and everything and digging foundations and so on and so forth for something like this? What kind of impact would that have?
Excellent.
On disruption of soils? Because I know that these chemicals leach, and you're going to have a lot higher concentration here, but it's going to leach out and balloon out. And so I'm afraid that when we're doing some of this work, we're going to get out and we can disturb some of that and release a lot of that. Is that an issue that's being looked at, or how do we mitigate some of those concerns?
That comes with, first of all, the remedial investigation that happened prior to 1993 gave us a good map of where the hot contamination was versus the moderate versus the not so contaminated versus the uncontaminated. And along with the consolidating of the waste and making sure we meet our cleanup levels, the way we make sure we meet our cleanup levels is through sampling. And so when we think we're down to the level where it's appropriate to sample, we'll sample, make sure we have clearance, meaning that we meet our cleanup levels, and so that we can be assured that everything is going to be in that 9-acre CAMU. As far as digging, if we do our job and clean up correctly, as long as you do not, as the contractor, the construction does not go as deep as the groundwater, which it's a groundwater control area already, you'll be able to do the construction and build as you see fit, because that area should be cleaned up. The only institutional control on the clean area that we leave behind, we're hoping, is to prevent residential development, which was in the ROD all along.
David, I just have one quick question. Is one of the topics that's going to be covered on Tuesday going to be the monitoring from the time that whatever remediation is decided is the best way to remediate the site going forward, as far as making sure that it stays clean 30 years from now, 40 years from now, and what's the funding mechanism for that if it's going to be that way?
Again, great question. These are things I have to deal with all the time, and I can talk all night about it over beer or whatever. But with something like a CAMU or a repository, which is what we generally refer to them as, I'm cleaning up the Upper Blackfoot mining complex right now. It has close to 1 million cubic yards of mine waste in it. We set aside there a trust to just cover the operation and maintenance of that repository. And my vision, while we haven't started down that path yet, my vision is to do the same thing.
Okay, thank you.
To have some type of trust or, fiduciary responsibility to the operation and maintenance of that cap.
Sure. Commissioner McDonough.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I guess my question kind of parlays off Commissioner Fisher's earlier comments and Commissioner Morgan's. Would future exploration of the contaminants that were discussed under the interstate or the railroad be taken out of this same $28 million fund, or would you set up another funding mechanism like a trust to deal with future exploration?
Good. Good question again. Same $28 million. Obviously this construction, what's interesting is we've been floating around that $28 million for quite a while. It's the interest in everything has helped the operation and maintenance of the water treatment plant and everything. But this construction is going to take a bite out of that. And so we're not going to have quite the returns that we've been having. However, it's our hope through the second phase, which is the investigatory phase and design that we're going to go into for the groundwater on the north side and the upgrades to the water treatment plant. It's our vision that will create a shorter operation time for the water treatment plant, because if we can get at and effectively reduce the source material under the interstate and a few other hot spots, it's going to enhance the effectiveness of the water treatment plant, and hopefully the lifetime will shorten on the water treatment plant as well. But those answers are yet to come.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Frederickson.
Thank you, Chairman Morgan. I just want to make the comment that 5 of us will not be able to be there on Tuesday because we're awarding economic mill levy fund money at that time. So if you don't see some of us there, don't think that we're not wanting to be there. So, but thank you for presenting to us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, is there any other questions?
Just in closing, we've been talking a lot about the 9 acres, the CAMU, but I want to emphasize the other 27 acres go into what we were talking about as far as the hope, the vision of unrestricted industrial and commercial use for that, and that it could be something similar to Bonner from that perspective.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Moving on to Section 1, Communications, 19-140. Ed Banderob, resident of the Greater Butte-Silver Bow community, requesting Council Commissioners Request the chief executive to designate an appropriate entity to conduct a survey, prepare a feasibility proposal, and recommendation relative to a green container biodegradable waste management program to complement the present landfill composting and alley rally programs. I believe we'll continue to hold this in abeyance as the chief executive's office is currently working on this. Communicate your number 2, communication 19443. Eldon Beal, citizen, requesting Council of Commissioners authorize the Chief Executive to amend and include Emma Park BSB County Code of Ordinances, Chapter 9.16, Park Restrictions, and to include penalties and or fines, etc. I believe, Mr. Gallagher, you have an update on this communication, if you would come before the Council. And Mr. Beal, I'll give you an opportunity here in a second.
Chairman Morgan, council members, for the record, I'm J.P. Gallagher, Parks and Rec Director for Butte-Silver. At our January Parks and Rec meeting, the Parks and Rec Board took into consideration the letter that Mr. Beal sent in to Chief Executive Palmer about amending the park ordinance with prohibiting alcohol and things at Emma Park, much like it was at Heritage Park, Mural Park, the Civic Center, and at the bus depot. The Parks and Rec Board listened to Mr. Beal. He came and spoke on behalf of the letter and took into consideration of the problems that we're having at Emma Park. And the Parks and Rec Board were thoughtful about their consideration of this letter, but their recommendation is not to change anything there, because Emma Park is a park that has a gazebo, has picnic areas, has things that families do use. The Parks and Rec Board determined that we do have an issue there with some vagrancy, some loitering around the area. And so working more with the police department and addressing some of those issues, along with the dog issues that we have there. So it was the recommendation of the Parks and Rec Board to put up signs about the dogs, no dogs allowed, with allowing, I've worked with Director Randall with the Animal Services to add phone numbers on there for the animal services for them to call directly, along with parks maintenance and things on there to address the issues. The consideration was that there are a lot of events over at Emma Park that people like to gather for. I know the Grizzlies have come to town, and they had tailgates over there. When we had the state championship games, there was tailgates over there as well. So the restricting of alcohol in that park was a big consideration, is that there still are gatherings where people do go over, gather, families gather, and utilize that park. And by changing the ordinance, you restrict any kind of activity over there. The former Friends of Stoughton Park, as well, that has changed their name now to the Friends of Butte Parks and Trails, is considering bringing back lunch in the park, where we're going to have activities in the park as well. So all of those things were in consideration. Not taking anything away from this letter, there are issues at Emma Park, and I think that we need to address some of those issues, but changing the ordinance itself was the recommendation from the Parks and Rec Board was not to change any of the ordinance with regard to Emma Park.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Beal.
Commissioner Morgan, commissioners. I don't agree with a lot of the non-drinking, because there are a lot of, the ordinances about drinking. The issues that we see over there, is there going to be bathrooms over there? Because we see people over there urinating. We see them all the time over there. It's like, loitering. So far, loitering and vagrancy, I don't think, checking state laws that they actually have any, that they can really do anything about them. But, with the dogs and everything, I went by 3 parks today. I see some of the signs about the dogs, and then what do I see in the snow? Dog prints. Every park had speed limit signs that Emmett Park doesn't have. You know, if it's going to be a park, then let's have something there for kids to do and people to do there, you know, instead of just being this blah park, you know.
Okay, thank you. Any commissioners have any comments? Commissioner Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, JP. You know, it's really kind of a catch-22 because we do not have vagrancy or loitering laws. They don't exist. And I think we did back before we consolidated into a city-county government. And that's, you know, several things fell through the cracks back in those days. But I believe public drunkenness is still illegal. I believe that's a violation of our laws. If there's any kind of, you know, menacing or harassment, that's like a misdemeanor, disorderly conduct. But I have seen, you know, apparently there was a time when we didn't have the homeless shelter and there were things going on and people were trying to find a place to eat. But unfortunately, you know, a lot of things were going on, public urination, dogs, harassment, I'd say. So all I can ask is that our police department, you know, keeps an eye on it, I guess. But I really don't know what we can really hang our hat on as far as vagrancy and loitering since we don't have laws. The dogs, I appreciate the signs, and this is not my district, this is Commissioner Anderson's district, but I was asked, you know, to look into it as well. But anyway, yeah, I don't know really how we can solve this problem, and I would love to see Lunch in the Park come back. But again, you know, I mean, it needs to have that appearance of an invitation to a fun family place to be, you know, I think that's the main thing. But again, it's problematic. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Shaw. I guess I would reach out to the guy that probably doesn't want me to call on him, Sheriff Lester. I see you're in the audience incognito, but I kind of want to ask your opinion on this. As far as the police go, what's your thought on all that?
Well, there is no public intoxication ordinance. There is ordinances, disorderly conduct, specifically being in a condition that serves no legitimate purpose. So if they're passed out on the grass or something like that, we can call and take some action. A lot of this stems from the complaints we had in the business district, where we actually moved them out of the business district, and whether it's gravity or what the situation is, that just happens to be the next stop. And so it's really that same group of people that were causing the issues in the business district. There's about 7 or 8 of them. And so I agree with the Park and Recreation Board. I don't think changing the ordinance is probably the way to go. I think it's more of a neighborhood awareness type situation, and we can do the best we can to step up. But you have to understand, when you build a bench and there's no ordinance to enforce as far as people drinking in a park, it's difficult to enforce that. But we'll certainly step up if we see panhandling or they're urinating in the park or those kind of things. We can enforce those things, and we'll make an effort to try and do a better job at that. I think when the weather gets nice again, we'll see an uptick in it.
Thank you. Any other questions? Commissioner Fisher.
Thank you, Chairman Morgan. Thank you, Eldon, JP, Sheriff Ed. Eldon, I think by bringing this forward and having it on the agenda for the last month or so we have, I think you've raised the concern needed to alleviate a lot of the problems going on in the park. And you heard firsthand, Sheriff Lester said he would be stepping up his patrols in the area. As for the bathrooms, I think it wouldn't be a problem to get the porta potties that we use even on the golf course or some other areas. So I think by raising this concern, you have created the need to alleviate some of your problems. I'm not saying they're going to alleviate all of them, but cost effectiveness, I think you've created a solution to the problem. And I agree with the Park and Rec Board that they're doing all they can, and I hope it satisfied the needs of you and your neighbors. And JP and Ed, thank you for your input.
Okay, I'm looking for a motion. Commissioner Fisher.
Thank you, Chairman Morgan. I would make a motion at this time that we place on file communication 19-443.
Second.
Okay, there's been a motion made and seconded to place communication 19443 on file. Is there anything on the question? Okay, would everyone please vote? Okay, would anyone like to change their vote? Would the clerk please record the vote?
We have 9 yea and 3 nay.
Okay, looks like the motion passes. Next item is communication 19466. Eric Mankins, Commissioner District Number 9, requesting Council of Commissioners authorize the Chief Executive to discuss a change in the zoning ordinance requiring community residential facilities as defined by state law to obtain a conditional use permit within Butte-Silver Bow County in all residential zoning districts, including R1, R2, R3, R4S, and R4 or RC. We'll continue to hold this in abeyance as it's working through the process as we speak. Number 4, communication 19571. Greeley Neighborhood Community Development Corporation requesting Council of Commissioners authorize the Chief Executive to form a Butte-Silver Bow Hazardous to Human Health Heavy Metals Contamination or Contaminants Task Force. We'll continue to hold this one in abeyance pending the Chief Executive's report back. Number 5, communication 19578. Gary Rundle, citizen, requesting Council of Commissioners consideration to purchase property located at 1820 Banks Avenue, Butte, Montana. I wish to redeem the property from the Butte-Silver Bow before the tax sale in February. We'll continue to hold this in abeyance pending the resolution that I will talk about here in a few minutes. Number 6, communication 19581. Patsy Coates, property specialist, requesting Council of Commissioners approval of the tax deed public auction to be held on February 5th, 2020, and to request the County Attorney's Office to prepare a council resolution to be read and acted upon the same night as the tax deed public auction. Commissioner Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We did have that occurred on the 5th, and we had a resolution that we need to cross-reference. So at this time, I'll make a motion to cross-reference this communication 19-581 with resolution number 2020-07 and place this on file.
Second. Thank you. There's been a motion made and seconded. Is there anything on the question? Would everyone please vote? Okay, would anyone like to change their vote? Would the clerk please record the vote?
12 yea and 0 nay.
Thank you. The motion passes. Number 7, communication 19582. Ed Banderob, Greeley Neighborhood Community Development Corporation, requesting Council of Commissioners to invite a Montana DPHS toxicologist to give a presentation relative to the hazard risks to human health of heavy metal contaminants present in the Butte-Silver Bow community. Ms. Sullivan has been working very diligently on trying to get somebody from the state to come and talk to us. We had a meeting lined up, but unfortunately the state toxicologist has left his position and has resigned. And so the state at this point has canceled the meeting, and hopefully we will have something scheduled in the future. But we'll continue to hold this in abeyance, and I'll continue to work with Ms. Sullivan on getting the next replacement. Sorry, Ed, but we're trying. We thought we had it figured out. But thank you, Karen, for your work on trying to get this here. So, Commissioner Mankins on the question.
Yes, I would also like to just thank Karen for what she's doing in trying to get this. I know this has probably been a huge burden on your department and everything on you with how many mothers and grandmothers and dads, moms, grandpas out there. I know this was a huge burden on myself, and I really wish that this gentleman or female was here tonight so we could hopefully get to the bottom of this and alleviate this issue within your department. So thank you for your work.
Okay, so we'll continue to hold this in abeyance pending that meeting. Number 8, Communication 20-04, Michael Townsend, citizen requesting Council of Commissioners to consider the repurchase of my home located at 105 West Porphyry. I will comply with all the rules and regulations of the Community Enrichment Program. We'll continue to hold this in abeyance pending the resolution that I'm going to talk about here in a few minutes. Number 9, Communication 20-26, Nakia Green, Remedial Project Manager, U.S. EPA Region 8, Montana Office, requesting Council Commissioners' time on the February 5th, 2020 agenda for a brief presentation regarding the EPA's review of the recent cross-section pilot study in Butte and the Columbia titled Mercurium identified high levels of metals in newborns from a mining community in the U.S. You guys did have, this presentation was held, so Commissioner Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At this time, I move to place Communication 2020-26 on file.
Second.
Okay, there's been a motion made and seconded. Would everyone please vote? Is there anything on the question? Seeing none, would everyone please vote? Would anyone like to change their vote? Would the clerk please record the vote?
12 yea and 0 nay.
Thank you. Motion passes. Number 10, Communication 20-46, Michelle Shea, District 2 Commissioner, requesting Council of Commissioners consider establishing a process providing for the sale and disposition of real property during the period between the first tax sale auction and the second tax sale auction. This would require that the county attorney prepare and introduce such a resolution as provided. A couple of housekeeping items. The county attorney did provide each of us a copy of the resolution that she and her office has drafted. One thing moving forward with this is I'm going to ask Miss Davies, Barb, as the motion stated, it was to refer this to the Committee of the Whole acting as the Judiciary Committee. So at our next Committee of the Whole meeting, I'll ask Barb to create a separate agenda item that's going to be titled just like the Judiciary Committee is, except it will be the Judiciary Committee acting as the committee, or the Committee of the Whole acting as the Judiciary Committee at 7:30 in this same room. And at that point, Commissioner McDonough I believe is the chair of the Judiciary Committee, will be chairing that meeting, and we will just be here as the commissioner. So Barb, I'll work with you to work on that agenda, but we'll do that for the next Committee of the Whole meeting from that. Along those lines, the resolution that is presented on your desk gives you kind of a rough draft of what the county attorney has started to draft. She has asked me to point out a couple of things in it for input from the commissioners. The first one, or the first section to pay particular attention to is on page 5, which goes through and sets forth the requirements that must be met in order for these individuals to reclaim their property. There are currently 4 bulleted items on there for your review to look at. Again, the whole resolution is before you to review, but I just wanted to point those out. I don't know if any of the commissioners have any thoughts or comments on those tonight to further the resolution being drafted in the county attorney's office, but we will discuss this at a later time as well. So this time I would just open it up to the council if they have any questions. Commissioner Fisher.
Thank you, Chairman Morgan. Question is, does the handout that Treasurer Ms. Baker gave us correspond with the information here?
Well, it just so happens, Commissioner Fisher, that Ms. Baker is here. And so I will let her answer that question. Ms. Patrick.
Ms. Patrick, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Council of Commissioners. Yes, that handout I did hand out will reflect upon the resolution that has been drafted.
Okay. Is there anything you'd like to add at this time as they consider the resolution and or your piece of paper?
No, but I'll answer questions.
Okay. Does any commissioners have any questions at this time? Commissioner Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not a question, but my comment is I'm assuming that we don't know exactly how many days are going to transpire between now and when we resolve this issue. So those numbers might vary slightly as far as prorated taxes and things like that, correct?
Yes, that's correct. And the other thing that we put on here is utility costs, and that we wouldn't know at this time either.
Thank you.
Okay, is there anything else on the question? Commissioner Fisher, then Commissioner McDonough.
Thank you, Chairman Morgan, once again. So these property owners would be required to pay the full amount within a certain amount of time after the resolution is approved, or if it is approved, I guess.
Yes, as far as the two folks that were taken off the tax sale, yes, they will have a certain amount of time once this is approved. However, moving forward, when the resolution has been passed, there will be also a time frame which is expressed in the resolution between the first and second sale of when they have to complete this process.
Okay, Commissioner McDonough.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In regards to the utility costs, it says the outstanding utility costs. Is that what's current for the month that we may resolve this, or is this from the time that we took the deed?
If there are any delinquencies with our water division, they would have to clear those up along with this process so that there is no debt with Butte-Silver Bow.
Follow-up, Commissioner McDonough.
So not to put you on the spot, but as I understand it now, aren't we paying the utility costs with Northwestern Energy if the property is in our name and they live in it with utilities on outside of just water with Butte-Silver Bow?
No, but I'm going to have Eileen.
County Attorney Joyce.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner McDonough, between the first and second tax sale, we aren't paying those power bills, and it's my understanding that Northwestern Energy, in fact, won't allow Butte-Silver Bow to be the entity that asks for the power to be shut off because it's not in our name. It's still in the name of the taxpayer. And so the intent of the resolution, is for them to pay at least Butte-Silver Bow utilities that would be owned, because we can have the water shut off if we want to between the first and second tax sale, if it isn't in the winter and we're not, causing issues for people in that regard. But the power bills are never in Butte-Silver Bow's name, and therefore we're not allowed to be the one to ask that those power bills be shut off.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Commissioner Shea.
Thank you, Chairman Morgan. County Attorney Joyce, thank you for this draft of this resolution. I think it looks really good, and I think it is right in line with what we were kind of envisioning. And I know you went into this pretty blind, so you did a great job. I just would like a little clarification on page 6, line 7. Pay any and all outstanding liens against the real property and have the property in compliance with all city, counties, local ordinances. I assume that those outstanding liens would be fees and fines that may have been levied against the property owner or the property by the city, county, not necessarily bank liens or anything of that nature.
County Attorney Joyce.
Mr. Shea, Mr. Chairman, yes, I believe that's the intention. When we do hold a tax sale, one of the things that the people that bid at a tax sale are advised is that all liens are going to be extinguished. So that's why the laws require you to provide notice to any lien holder so that they have an opportunity to come in and get the property back. That's banks or whoever might have a judgment lien against that property. So when no bidders apply at the or show up at the first sale, then the liens aren't extinguished because it still reverts back to Butte-Silver Bow. But we can clarify that we want just, I guess, liens that are affect Butte-Silver Bow. And I did work with Pat Reardon and Danek Gleason and Dan Fisher and Lori Patrick, just to get their input on what the staff would recommend. And so that's how we came up with the criteria in this resolution. But as the council knows, you haven't actually voted to go through with this resolution. But I just wanted something for the council to take into consideration if that's what they decide to do.
Follow-up, Commissioner Shea.
Thank you. Obviously, thank you to everyone else on the staff that had a hand in putting something together, and thank you for mentioning that, Eileen. I do think that it's important that your input is paramount because you are the ones charged with enforcement of it. So, thank you.
County Attorney Joyce, I would just have a couple questions for you. So, this resolution is presented to us in draft form. It doesn't have a resolution number. So can you tell me what the next step would be? I believe it would be to start moving this resolution to readings, but maybe not based on your head. So can you just kind of map it out moving forward?
Sure. Mr. Chairman, so I think in 2 weeks when you're going to have the Committee of the Whole City as the Judiciary Committee, you're going to have to make a decision regarding whether or not you want this a resolution like this to be introduced, because the only action that the council has taken to date is for that to happen, for this particular communication to be considered by the Committee of the Whole sitting as the judiciary. So I think in 2 weeks when that is on an agenda, the council can have a discussion about whether or not they really want this type of a resolution introduced, and if there's a motion made to introduce this resolution, the council will also discuss whether they want it in this form or they want additions or things taken out, and then if that's the way it goes, then I can introduce a resolution and it'll go through the resolution process.
Okay.
Which this does require a public hearing to be held.
Okay. Thank you very much for that clarification. Okay, is there anything else on the question? So we'll continue to hold this communication in abeyance. It will be on a separate agenda item in 2 weeks. Moving on to communication 1120-53, John Cody Family LLC, requesting Council of Commissioners consideration in purchasing a vacant lot that is currently owned by Butte-Silver Bow. We own the lots on 3 sides of this property, and we like to purchase this lot to make it more feasible to develop our adjacent properties. We'll continue to hold that in abeyance as it was a topic on the Land Sales Committee this week, so we'll continue to hold it in abeyance. Communication 20-54, Lori Casey, Planning Director, requesting Council of Commissioners for time on the February 12th, 2020 Council of Commissioners agenda for a presentation to be given by Kelly Lynch, Deputy Director, Council for the Montana League of Cities and Town regarding municipal zoning. Commissioner Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At this time, I move to place Communication 2020-54 on file.
Second.
Okay, there's been a motion made and seconded. Is there anything on the question? Would everyone please vote? Commissioner Mankins on the question. The motion is just to place Communication 20-54 on file. Correct, yeah. Commissioner Shaw?
That's correct.
Okay, would anyone like to change their vote? Would the clerk please record the vote?
We have 12 yea and 0 nay.
Okay, thank you. Motion passes. Communication 20-56, Jenny Chambers, Waste Management and Remediation Division Administrator, requesting Council of Commissioners for time on the February 12th Council of Commissioners agenda for a presentation to be given by the Montana Department of DEQ and Environmental Quality. Commissioner Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to place Communication 2020-56 on file.
Second.
Okay, there's been a motion made and seconded. Is there anything on the question? Would everyone please vote? Okay. Would anyone like to change their vote? Would the clerk please record the vote?
12 yea and 0 nay.
Thank you. Motion passes. Commissioner Sorich, you're having problems with electronics today. Number 14, Communication 20-57, Danette Gleason, Finance and Budget Director, requesting Council Commissioners schedule a public hearing on February 26th to take public comment on amending the fiscal year 2020 General Fund Courthouse Improvement Budget. We will continue to hold this in abeyance pending the February 26th date. Communication 20-58, Dan Olson, Commissioner District Number 5, requesting Council Commissioners schedule the economic mill levy presentations on Tuesday, February 18th and Thursday, February 20th, 2020 from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. The presenters will be allowed a 10-minute presentation every 15 minutes for the mill levies. I believe we'll just continue to hold this in abeyance pending those dates. Barb will have to publish a public notice of these meetings to be held at this time, so she'll have to include those in this week's agenda to be held, so she can add those to this week's agenda. Number 16, Communication 20-59, Charlie O'Leary, 3060 Beef Trail Road, requesting Council Commissioners to pass a resolution for a question to be placed on the June 2nd, 2020 local election. The question should be whether the voters of Butte-Silver Bow wish to reauthorize the imposition of the Economic Department levy as defined in MCA 90-5-112 for another 4 years. Continue to hold this in abeyance pending a resolution being brought forward. Number 17, Communication 20-60, Danette Gleason, Finance and Budget Director, requesting Council of Commissioners time on the February 12th, 2020 Council of Commissioners agenda for a presentation to allow time for Pat Burt, partner, Newland and Company PC, and the Finance and Budget Department to present the fiscal year 2019 Comprehensive Annual Fiscal Report, the CAFR, and the federal schedule of awards. The presentation will include the audit findings and management responses for fiscal year ending in year June 30th, 2019. We will continue to hold that in abeyance till the 26th of February, where Ms. Gleason will be presenting. Continue to hold that in abeyance. Last item on tonight's agenda is any public comment on any public matter that's not on tonight's agenda. Mr. Banderab, please state your name and address for the record.
Alright, Banderab, 2601 Grand Avenue. For the general good of the general public, I would suggest that you do extend an invitation to Dr. Keller or Haiti to do a representation of the presentation she gave prior to several of the newbies coming on the council, where we have the 4 or 5 other independent studies and a couple individual analysis, and we could have a summary, because the comment made really pertains to the next item, not the item on which the comment was made. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Banderab. Anything else to come before the body? I would ask for a motion to adjourn. Okay, motion made and seconded. All those in favor? All opposed? Motion passes. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you.